Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott from Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. Welcome to my home. We are doing our midweek Torah studies. This is the time that we would normally do a Torah portion and review the Torah portion and do a study on the Torah portion. And that's how we normally do this on these midweek teaching times. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. On your screen somewhere, you may have a chance to subscribe to YouTube. If you do that, you will be notified of all of our videos whenever we post them. Likewise, there are links to our website where you can learn more about the ministry of Beth Yeshua. And also there are, on the YouTube channel, there are other videos as well for our Shabbat services. So enough of that, getting some of the housekeeping taken care of straight away. Let us begin. As I said, we would normally do the Torah portion. This week's Torah portion is Bahar, which is on the mountain, and Bechu Kotai, by my regulations, both from Leviticus, Vayikra, chapters 25 through the end of Leviticus. This week we are finishing up Leviticus, and we start Bamidbar, Numbers, next week. But this week I wanted to make a departure. I wanted to address some things, current events, where we're at with the nature of things in our society, and I wanted to address some things from that perspective. Excuse me while I make a minor adjustment here. I wanted to make some correction, or I wanted to make some comments and explore and discuss some things about where we are, of course, with the coronavirus. These are the important things of our time. There's a restlessness in our society. Some people are wanting to get back to normal. Some people are itching to get back to work. And these are very real concerns as people's livelihoods are threatened, their economic well-being is threatened. It's very difficult. And other people are very concerned that if we start socializing again, if we start being active again, that straight away we are going to have some issues with rebound and more effects from this coronavirus. And so we have these two ends of the spectrum, the pendulum swinging back and forth. And I have to acknowledge that for me as a human being, as a person, there are times when I feel restless and impatient and I want to get back to normalcy. And then there are times when I'm just uncomfortable with the fear of what could be lurking out there in a chance gesture or communication or contact with another person who might be carrying this virus. I'm going to try to address this tonight in part, and if you've been following these teachings, you notice straight away that the Wednesday night teachings flow into the Shabbat teachings and to the Darash. What I've been able to do so far is kind of have a little bit of a thematic thread weaving its way through all these sort of videos and teachings and Shabbat services. So I'm going to open this topic up, and then I'm probably going to address it further in the message on Shabbat. So again, this is a bit of a departure. To start with, I want to give credit to a group called Aleph Beta and Rabbi David Foreman. This is an Orthodox teaching ministry, conservative Jewish teaching ministry, not Messianic. They would not recognize Yeshua as Mashiach ben Elohim, the King of Israel. They would not recognize anything having to do with a Messianic perspective on the Torah or a Messianic perspective on Judaism from Yeshua's standpoint. They do incredible work in Torah study and teaching. They are into intertextual research and teaching. If you followed my teaching, you would recognize biblical intertextuality, because this is a methodology that I use extensively when I teach. And this is one of their probably their chief specialty is the research of the Torah from the framework of from the methodology of biblical intertextuality. And so for me, it's very comfortable. It's very familiar ground, very familiar territory. Aleph Beta has done some work recently on the Shemona Esrei. The Shemona Esrei is one of the set time prayers. It's also called the Amidah, the standing prayer. It's probably one of the most central prayers to Jewish worship. And this prayer, the Shemona Esrei, has these parts, and as they were going through the Shemona Esrei and researching and studying and teaching on it, they came to the part of the prayer that speaks of healing, refuah. And here we are in the midst of the coronavirus, the COVID epidemic, and they're addressing the Shemona Esrei in the part where it talks about our healing. So tonight I want to drill down to this, into this teaching, and again credit to Rabbi David Foreman and Aleph Beta for producing the work that they did. If you have followed them recently, then you might recognize some or most or a good portion of what I'm going to talk about tonight. But as long as I give them credit, I think it's okay. So let's talk about the coronavirus. Let's talk about COVID, if you will. It is on the one hand, it's very real. It's a virus, and it has a very real effect. Most of us have seen the circle with the little crowns around the circle, and the cartoon image of the coronavirus. It can be viewed. It can be viewed with a microscope or an electron microscope. Instruments can view it. On the other hand, though, it's invisible. We can't see it. You can pass somebody on the street, and what's the word we use? We use asymptomatic. They might be carrying it. They may not be carrying it. So we have this sort of surrealistic issue with this coronavirus, in that it's very real, but it's also invisible. So how do we pray? We ask God to deliver us from this sort of plague, from this sickness. And the place in the Torah where we come to understand Adonai as a healer is the episode of the bitter waters, shortly after the victory at the Sea of Reeds, the beginning of the Exodus, the beginning of Shemot. So let's look at that text, if you will, Shemot chapter 15, Exodus chapter 15. Moses led Israel onward from the Sea of Reeds. They went out into the wilderness of Shur, but they traveled 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink from the waters because they were bitter. On account of this, it was called Marah. So the people complained to Moses, saying, "What are we going to drink?" And so he cried out to Adonai, and Adonai showed him a tree. When he threw it into the waters, they were made sweet. There he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them. He said, "If you diligently listen to the voice of Adonai your God, to do what is right in his eyes, pay attention to his mitzvot, and keep all his decrees, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I am Adonai who heals you." So that's the place in the Torah where we come to understand his healing, that God is going to heal us. We're going to break this down a little bit to try to understand it, and then we'll try to introduce an idea of healing that addresses our fears with the COVID-19 disease. And so what we have in Exodus chapter 15, we're going to break this down. They traveled 3 days. They were very thirsty. What's the rule? 3 days, 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without air. So they had lasted 3 days without water. So they're truly thirsty. And they came to Marah. Marah means bitter or bad. It says they could not drink because they were bitter. There is some ambiguity in the Hebrew in this text. There is some intrinsic ambiguity that we run into right away. It says they could not drink because they were bitter. The easy reading of the text is the people could not drink because the waters were bitter. But immediately if you look at the text, you have to question whether or not there's another reading here, another possibility of that of the people being bitter. What would bolster or explain their bitterness? Why would they be bitter? What episode directly precedes the episode of the bitter waters? Back up in your text and you'll see it. It's the episode at the Sea of Reeds. And just to review the episode of the Sea of Reeds. So Adonai had delivered them after the Passover, and they were driven out of Egypt. They were told to leave right away. And so they began to leave Egypt. And then we see this. They traveled to Sukkot the first night. And then we see this, that Adonai had them wander around the desert a little bit and come to the Sea of Reeds. And while they were there at the Sea of Reeds, it was reported to Pharaoh that they were wandering in the desert, and Pharaoh emboldened. It says that Adonai hardened his heart, and so Pharaoh emboldened tries to wipe out the Jews as they're backed up against the sea. And so he comes out with all of his chariots and horsemen and his armies, and they're going to destroy the people of Israel there as they're backed up against the sea. They cry out to Adonai, and Moses parts the sea with his staff, and they walk through on dry ground. And the people of Pharaoh, the Egyptians, attempt to follow them, and their wheels come off their chariots. They get stuck in the mud, and the people of Israel walk through on dry ground, walk out the other side, and the waters close back in on Pharaoh, and Pharaoh disappears from history. Truly disappears, because the waters covered him up. And that's the deliverance, the victory over the Egyptians that Adonai extended to Israel. At the end of this, they come out and they sing a song. And we have these lines in the song, this recurring theme, this refrain through the song. They come out and they sing the song, and the opening line is, "I will sing to Adonai, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." And then we skip down a bit. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea, and his chosen captains have sunk into the Sea of Reeds. Skip down a little bit. "You blew with your wind. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters." In verse 9 it says this, "For Pharaoh's horses with its chariots and its horsemen went into the sea, but Adonai brought the waters of the sea back over them. Yet Bnei Israel walked in the midst of the sea on dry ground." What does all this remind us of? What is this an echo of? The sinking, the sea, being hurled into the waters, reeds. What does this remind us of? Here's the next clue. Then Miriam, verse 20, Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing, as Miriam sang to them, "Sing to Adonai, for he has highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." So we have this. Miriam goes out. All the women go with her. Miriam singing to them, and she echoes this refrain once again, "Sing to Adonai, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." There's something significant happening here with Miriam singing to the women like this. So for more understanding of this, let's look at Miriam. Where do we know Miriam from? From Shemot, Exodus chapter 2. "Now a man from the house of Levi took as his wife a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived, gave birth to a son. Now when she saw that he was delightful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took a basket of papyrus reeds and coated it with tar and pitch and put the child inside, laid it in the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood off at a distance to see what would happen to him. This is the child who will be named Moses, and this is after the edict of Pharaoh. The child, the sister, standing off at a distance to see what would happen to him. This is Miriam." In chapter 1 of Shemot, Pharaoh decrees this. First, that the people will be enslaved, building storehouses. Next, he decrees that the midwives are commanded to kill the baby boys of the Hebrews, the Hebrew women, the Israelites, at birth. And then, when that proves to be unsuccessful, Pharaoh instructs all the people to throw the Hebrew boys into the Nile. going back, these are the 3 decrees by Pharaoh at the beginning of Shemot, beginning of Exodus. Um, First of all, this enslaving to build storehouses, kind of a menial labor. If you had an enslaved population, what would you put them to work doing? If you were ambitious and wanted to be a very successful king to increase your wealth, and you had a great people in your midst, what would you do with those people? Would you have them build silos? Would you have them build grain storehouses? I mean, I can think of much more technical projects that Pharaoh could have had the Israelites involved in, rather than just, the menial labor of building storehouses. Rabbi Foreman compares it to Nazi Germany, which had the Jews make uniforms and other ridiculous things. They certainly could have made the uniforms much cheaper than they did by the Jews who were imprisoned in the concentration camps. But it was this lie, this deception, this lie that work makes you free. It was the lie that they were productive. It was a form of brainwashing. It was a form of psychological warfare. It was a form of emotional and psychological torture. That you're going to do this job. It's a menial job. We're not going to feed you. We're going to enslave you and oppress you, and we're going to call it work, and we're going to pretend that you're necessary, useful, and productive. This is the lie, and what I want to try to communicate to you is how demoralizing that would be. With my children, they always wanted to know the purpose of what they were being told to do. And it's very demoralizing to not know a purpose, to not have a purpose to what you're doing. Next, Pharaoh commanded that the midwives kill the baby boys. Why? Because if you kill the boys but let the girls live, those girls will grow up and intermarry, because there will be no Hebrew boys. And then it'll be as if the Hebrews never existed. It's a way of still maintaining some population, but eliminating it's a form of genocide, eliminating the people of Israel. Next and last, the third thing that Pharaoh did is he decreed that all the Hebrew boys were to be thrown into the Nile. So let me just dwell on that a little bit, this idea of throwing a child into the Nile River. There's no grave. There's no evidence. There's no coffin. There's no corpse. It's as if the child never existed. It's as if that child never was. Do you see the deep kind of psychological warfare that would have on the family? Consider every couple is in deep fear, terror. If I have a daughter, she lives. If I have a son, he dies. That kind of psychological torture that lasts 9 months long from the time a woman realizes she's pregnant. She would be in complete abject fear. That kind of psychological torture. It's actually worse, I think, than if Pharaoh had just put all the children to death. If he had just decreed, okay, every Hebrew child that's born is going to be put to death. It's almost worse to make people go through this kind of terror. You remember when Adonai said to Abraham that back in Bereshit, back in Genesis, that the people were going to be enslaved for 400 years, and we have this what's called the covenant of the pieces, the covenant of the parts, and we have this kind of darkness and terror that came upon Abraham. And in the midst of the darkness and terror, you have this, a smoking pot, a fire pot, a clay oven, a smoking pot, and a firebrand, a torch. And so we have darkness, we have terror, and then we have this smoking, glowing red fire pot, and then we have this fiery torch passing through the gloom. Truly horrific image that Adonai painted about the people who were going to be enslaved in Egypt. And this is what was going to happen. So this is the terror that I want you to kind of get a sense of that must have been going through the mind of these people. First of all, it was a form of psychological warfare on the family. It would destroy marriages. It would destroy couples. It would destroy a person's sense of well-being, their sense of fairness, their sense of trust. Another thing that I want you to consider is what happens when a mother loses a child through a stillbirth or through a miscarriage. Many of these women are afraid to start over. Many of these women are scarred for a very long time. And it's a very difficult scenario. So let's just put that all together. In this context, we see that the mother of Moses keeps the baby for 3 months. He's a beautiful child, the text says. And all mothers think their children are beautiful, but some children are exceptionally beautiful and delightful. And she hides him for 3 months, and then he's too noisy. And consider the fear that she is dealing with. The child's too noisy. And so she puts the baby Moses in a basket. Now, what is this basket that she puts him in? She puts him in a basket on the waters. She has no expectation of anything good coming. The basket is a kind of coffin. And she puts the basket in at the riverside at the reeds, again with the reeds. And Miriam, the sister, stands at a distance to see what's going to happen to Moses. Now we see that Moses is rescued, but presumably countless other boys weren't. Countless other boys weren't so fortunate. The overall effect continued, the practice continued. Fast forward many years, Moses is called by Adonai in the Sinai desert to return to the Egyptians, and we have the first plague, the plague of blood. From Shemot chapter 7, Exodus chapter 7, Adonai says to Moses, "Say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, over their streams, over their pools, over all their ponds, so that they become blood. There will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in wooden and stone containers." So Moses and Aaron did as Adonai commanded. He lifted up the staff and struck the waters that were in the river in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and all the waters of the Nile turned to blood. When the fish that were in the river died, the river became so foul that the Egyptians could not drink water from the river. The blood was throughout all the land of Egypt. I want to bring a couple things to your attention. Specifically that it was when the fish that were in the river died, the river became foul. Implying that before the fish died, this is what they were drinking for water. There's blood, but in the water became blood, but they were still having to drink it. It wasn't until the fish died, the river became so foul, the Egyptians could not drink water from the river, and the blood was throughout all the land of Egypt. They will hate to drink the water, and this will be done by the staff of Moses. It says that the river became foul. So we have two events. We have the waters of bitterness in the death of all the Hebrew boys, and then we have the waters that were turned foul, turned to blood. We have the waters of bitterness and sorrow from the perspective of the Hebrews. We have the waters that were foul and offensive and bitter, turned to blood, that affected all the Egyptians. It's not clear in the text, but it seems to indicate that this was an affliction on the Egyptians and not on the people of Jacob, the people of Israel. So it was the Egyptians whose water became foul. It was the Egyptians whose water was turned to blood, which is a fascinating consideration, that you would have water, which on the one hand is good to drink, but on the other hand, a different person looking at it, it's going to say, no, you can't drink that, it's foul. All right, let's go back forward. Let's fast forward back to the episode at the Sea of Reeds. Once again, we have reeds. We have Pharaoh at the waters, and the waters closed over his neck, the same as when the little boys were thrown into the Nile. And we have this refrain over and over. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Miriam comes out to lead the women with tambourines and dancing. What is the dance? Well, we think of the dance as jubilant. We think of the dance as victorious. We think of the dance as exultant celebration. But let me point it out this way. I'm standing at the bank. I'm a woman, an Israelite woman, standing at the bank, the Sea of Reeds, and I've just witnessed the death of maybe 1,000 or more soldiers, 600 horsemen and chariots. I'm standing at the bank, and I see all these people die, and I see the waters close over them, and after a little while of turbulence, the waters become smooth, and Pharaoh and his horsemen have disappeared from history. They no longer exist. But it's the same way perhaps my child or my brother was thrown into the sea. This is my thought, that the dance is victorious, but the dance is also bittersweet. The dance is somber. And I want to bring to your attention that it was Miriam who sang the song to the women. It wasn't the women who came out and sang. It was Miriam who sang the song to the women. All right, let's move ahead to the episode of the waters of bitterness. Mara. Mara, the word bitter, bad, uses the same letters as Miriam. It's almost as if there's a play on words here. It's as if Maryam, you could pronounce Miriam, Maryam, which means bitter waters. Or they could not drink the waters because they were bitter. What was bitter in the waters? What is it, the water that was bitter, or was it the people who were bitter? A tree was actually thrown into the waters, and the waters became sweet. So there's something really happening with the water. There's something wrong with the water. But the text is ambiguous. Who was bitter? Was the water bitter, or were the people bitter, such that they couldn't drink? Is it they couldn't drink because they were bitter? Look what Adonai says. I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians. What diseases did Adonai put on the Egyptians? Is it the plagues? Let's look at the plagues. We'll start with number 2. Frogs, lice, flies. None of those are diseases. Diseased livestock, well, that's a disease, but it's on their livestock. Boils, that could be seen as a kind of disease. That's on a person, I get that. But how about hail, or locusts, or darkness? Those aren't diseases that a person, that Adonai would put on someone. And then the death of the firstborn. Perhaps some of us might think the death of the firstborn is a kind of disease, the death coming from sin, perhaps. But interesting that most are not diseases per se. The one I left out of this list, I started with number 2, the one I left out of this list is blood. Remember, they had to drink foul water. They didn't like the taste. It made them sick. They had to gag if they drank it. They couldn't drink it, just like at the waters of Mara. But Adonai says, if you will obey me, I will put none of this on you. But they've already lived through it. They've already lived through bitter waters. Here's what Adonai is saying, that if you don't sin, if you obey his mitzvot and keep his mitzvot, then he's not going to put any diseases upon you. But the question that I have is, what about the sickness in their hearts? They were already sick. They already needed healing. And it says, I am Adonai who heals you. So, what does all this mean to us? And this is where I want to pivot a little bit and try to talk about what we're dealing with currently. COVID-19. Notice that when someone is dying from COVID-19, at least the last that I've heard, you can't go see them. You're not allowed to sit with them. It's as if they sink beneath time and they're not to be seen again. Just like those little boys that were thrown into the Nile. Notice how on the one hand, I don't want to acknowledge this sickness. I want things to get back to normal. But at the same time, I'm kind of afraid of it too. There's a pendulum swing in my own heart, in my own mind,
back and forth, at fear and frustration. And what was the bitter waters of the Hebrew women? It was fear. Fear of having a child, fear of losing your child. When you lose a child, you don't want to try again. There is a deep fear of losing another child to any calamity, violence, or sickness. What is our fear? What fear are we dealing with? When people are talking about how we will never be the same, we will be wearing masks everywhere because we'll be afraid. We have two issues that we're dealing with in our current society at this time. We're dealing with the COVID, the coronavirus, absolutely. And like I said earlier, it's a real thing. We can see it on an electron microscope. But we're also dealing with the fear of something we can't see. It is both seen and unseen. What is the method of healing the waters of bitterness? It was this tree that was thrown into the waters. Moses touched the Nile with his staff, and it became blood. It became foul. Moses put a different stick, or a branch, or a tree into the waters, and it became sweet. I know that I'm oversimplifying it, so stay tuned. I'm going to try to develop this more in the days to come. But just to give you some hope, and just to give us a place to connect to. First of all, when Adonai says, I am the one who heals you, there are absolutely two aspects to that healing. Remember the woman with the issuance of blood who was bleeding, and Yeshua healed her. It wasn't just that she had a disease. It wasn't just that she was injured. That fear was woven in and through who she was. Fear that this was going to continue. Anytime you get sick, seriously sick, what is one of the things you're dealing with? You're dealing with fear. You're afraid of the unknown. You're afraid of where this goes. You're afraid of what happens to you. I've had people close to me who have been afflicted by mysterious ailments, unseen things, chemical exposures, allergen exposures, light exposures, where photophobia has damaged people in different ways. I know people who have dealt with this. And it isn't just the injury, it's the fear of where this goes, where this ends up. To look at Adonai, your healer, to look at him as a healer is not just a physiological, symptomatic issue. We joke about our doctors having a poor bedside manner, and we might think that that's kind of a joke. What is it that we're really saying there? It's as if we're saying that we need you to be more than just a physiological mechanic. When I take my car into the mechanic, I drop it off and I walk away, and I don't discuss my feelings with him. And I'm not really interested in him and how I feel about my car. And truthfully, I don't really feel much about my car anyway. It needs to go, and when it doesn't, I have it fixed. That's about the extent of my emotional connection and bonding and so forth with my automobile. But it's different with this, this machine here. It's that fear is woven up into any time I get sick. When Adonai came and had Moses throw the tree, the branch, the stick, into the waters, when he brought them to the waters, here's what I'm seeing in the text. There are two episodes that deal with healing back to back here. The first episode is at the edge of the Sea of Reeds when Miriam brings the women out, because the women were peculiarly affected by the edict of Pharaoh. It had a peculiar effect on them, a greater effect on them than it had on the men. And the women came out and they weren't singing. They had the tambourines, but they weren't singing. And it says in the text emphatically and clearly, Miriam sang to them. She was addressing their injury and their fear because they had been broken and scarred by what had happened. They had been deeply emotionally and psychologically injured by the edict of the pharaohs and the violence that was done to their children. And so Miriam, the prophetess, and again, so specific the word is for us. Miriam the prophetess, the prophet voice is speaking directly to the moment. This is what must happen in this moment. It's the role of the prophet in our tradition. This is, she is speaking this to them, and she says to them, the horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. In the same way that you were injured, Adonai has taken vengeance and injured him back. But here's the point of it, is that wasn't enough. They had to go a little further, and they got thirsty, and they came to the waters that were bitter. And once again, we're on the bank of some waters. We're on the bank of the shore, and it's bitter. Because I haven't been healed yet. I haven't been healed from the damage that was done. Yes, vengeance has come. The horse and its rider is thrown into the sea, and I danced the dance. But I think that dance was very bittersweet. Sorry, no pun intended. But I think that dance was very somber. Again, I don't think it was celebratory. All right. So they come to the waters of Marah, and the branch is thrown in there, the stick is thrown in there. I know that I'm oversimplifying it, and we're going to go deeper in the days to come, I hope, and I'm going to try to develop this more, but let me give you this, and here's the context for all of this. We are dealing with a real disease issue, a real disease problem in our society, but we are dealing with fear, which has paralyzed us. In the same way, the family was psychologically tortured by Pharaoh and the Egyptians, such that they were afraid to have a family. We now have people who are afraid to go out of their homes. Oh, we'll do it because we have to get groceries, but we are afraid. We now have a people who are afraid. Our society is largely afraid walking around. We have two epidemics we are dealing with. The first epidemic is the COVID epidemic, and I'll give you that. The second epidemic is fear. Zechariah 3:8, thus says Adonai Tzvaot, if you will walk in my ways and keep my charge, then you will judge my house and watch over my courts, and I will give you a place to walk among these standing here, speaking to Joshua the high priest. Again, it's a contingent issue. He says, if you will walk in my ways and keep my charge, or keep my mitzvot, you and your companions seated before you. He says, behold, I will bring forth my servant, the branch. Adonai is making a sign promise to Joshua the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. A sign promise is when Adonai says something, and then he says, and this will be the sign that I will do it. And he says this, behold, I will bring forth my servant, the branch. Notice the echo of walking in his ways and keeping his charge, keeping his mitzvot. But look, consider the branch. What is the branch? The branch is Yeshua. First Kepha, Peter, chapter 2, says this. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we, removed from sins, might live for righteousness. And by his wounds you were healed, or by his injuries you were healed. He allowed himself to be hung upon a tree that we might be healed. And by his wounds we are healed. This is our hope. This is our comforter. That Yeshua is our healing. He is the tree that makes the branch, that makes the water sweet. In Shemot, Exodus 15, Moses cried out to Adonai, and Adonai showed him a tree when he threw it into the waters, they were made sweet. This verbiage here, showed him a tree. The Hebrew there means to teach, to point out, to instruct. It isn't just to bring attention to, but it's to teach. And the emphasis there, it's almost as if you could say Adonai taught him the tree. And when he threw it into the waters, they were made sweet. It's almost a play on words. Yes, I believe that Adonai nudged Moses and he looked and there was a tree or a branch or a stick. So it was an actual branch. There's something very physical that's happening here, but there's also something spiritual that's happening here. He showed him a tree. He taught him the tree. And what does Adonai say? I am Adonai who heals you. It's not just the waters that were healed. In this Exodus 15, he says, Adonai says, I am Adonai who heals you. It wasn't just who made the water sweet and they drank and they were refreshed and they went on their way. In fact, the next lines in the text says they came to Elim where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. So they camped there by the waters. There's no indication of anything having to do with waters being bitter or sweet. They just went to the next place and there was waters. But at this point, it is drawing out the tension, is drawing out the balance. And there's two things that happen here. First, the waters are made sweet, and I am Adonai who heals you. It was your healing. So it's as if Miriam draws out the injury by drawing the women out from the Hebrews. And they do this dance on the edge of the Sea of Reeds. And I believe it's very somber. I believe it's very heart-wrenching. And she sings over them. She sings to them. Miriam the prophetess is singing to them and saying to them, the horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. And then the next episode we see that Moses is shown the stick, the branch, and he throws it into the waters. Here's my conclusion on COVID-19. It is a physiological reality. There is a virus out there, and it can make people very sick if you contract it. And yes, many people have died. Hundreds of thousands of people have contracted this, and likewise have died from this. The numbers in North America alone, the United States alone, I think are 85,000 at this count have died from this. Yes, it's a very unpleasant and very dangerous virus to contract. It is real. There is a reality, a physiological attack out there in the form of this virus. But also, it has damaged our psyche. It has damaged our spirits. It has damaged our faith. It has injured our peace and our trust. And we now live in fear. And I have to be honest with you. I don't succumb much to fear. I don't like fear. I don't like being vulnerable to fear. So I tend to push back against expressions of fear in my own personal life. So I would think that I would be largely immune to fear at this time. But a man walked up to me when I was in a store and walked up to me without a mask and began talking to me, and I was rattled. I was rattled because of the proximity, the contact. And I thought, I don't know you, and I don't know where you've been, and what are you doing, and why are you talking to me this way? What about social distance? And the signs are all over the stores, and the markings on the floor where you walk, and all this sort of thing. And here this fellow just walks up to me and starts talking to me, and I was rattled. I experienced fear. And another time a man thrust out his hand to shake my hand. And I knew this fellow, and I was afraid. I was rattled. I was in a hospital this week with one of our people, sharing an elevator with people. Once again, proximity. Some of them were wearing masks. Some of them weren't. Even I'm afraid, and I don't feel very comfortable with that. My trust needs to be in Adonai, and I need to be at peace. But we have been injured. And if we're going to cry out to Adonai for his healing, if we're going to cry out for deliverance, then I think we also need to cry out to be healed personally and corporately from the effects of this in fear and in terror. We need his healing. We need him to intervene and heal us from this COVID. We need him to give inspiration and genius and insight to the professionals and to the researchers so that they can win this battle. We need that. We need to be delivered from this sickness, this plague of sorts. But we also need to be healed. We need to be soothed and comforted. We need to be restored. And these are the things that I want to explore with you in the coming days, is how do we step into that healing? And I think it begins with really identifying fear, but identifying that Adonai has identified the fear and understands the depth of our community psyche, understands the depth of the community injury that has occurred. And just one statistic, and I'll just give this to you. Around the world right now, there are believers in Yeshua, mostly in the evangelical world, the Christian world, that meet in secret churches. They are afraid to meet because if they are caught and found out meeting, they can be arrested, they can be put to death, their children can be arrested and put to death, and so on. There is real persecution around the world right now. Yet in spite of that, these people continue to meet. In spite of the fear, they continue to meet in these underground hidden communities, hidden churches. We here in the United States of America have largely chosen not to meet because of fear, largely. Now I know there's been some decisions that have been made under the idea of loving your neighbor, of respecting authorities, and so on and so forth. And I appreciate that. I'm not saying that it's not a complex issue. It is a complex issue, absolutely. But I want us to be honest about one aspect of this, that one of the reasons why people are not meeting is because of fear. People are not assembling, people are not gathering. We've already missed Passover for the most part in most of our communities, and we have Shavuot on the near horizon, and that discussion is on a lot of people's minds. Are we going to meet for Shavuot? And we're discussing it as well. And it's a complex issue, I acknowledge that. But if we're going to cry out to Adonai, I think we need to be honest about the real depth of injury that we have received in our culture during these days. Okay, let me just end with that and offer you a blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you rest. Please be in touch if you have any questions or if you'd like to discuss any of this. And I'll look forward to next week or even on Shabbat if you choose to join us on Shabbat. In the meantime, truly, may Adonai keep you and bless you. Shalom, shalom.